Our next speaker, Mr. James Mackey, Managing Director, Project Capital at OGCI Climate Investments, speaking on today's topic, investment capital for decarbonization. Over to you, Mr. James.
Thank you very much, Melwin. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. I know we have an audience from various corners of the globe. I'm very pleased to join you today. And my topic today is investment capital for decarbonization. For this discussion, I have some prepared remarks that I'll go through, and I'll go through kind of 5 key areas that we'll discuss before some Q&A. First, I'll tell you a little bit about my firm, OGCI Climate Investments, talk a little bit about how we are approaching the climate challenge with our investment capital. And then I'll also spend a little bit of time talking about some of the economic and policy considerations that investors should keep in mind when looking at investing in decarbonization projects. I'll use some examples for a carbon capture and sequestration investment to show the types of returns one can expect. And then finally, I'll talk about capitalization in the context of the life cycle of a project from development through operations. Starting with OGCI and climate investments, many of you probably are familiar with the OGCI. The OGCI is the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. 12 major oil and gas producers from around the world are partners in this consortium to try and create impact. One way that we do that is through investments, and the member companies of OGCI set up the investment fund called OGCI Climate Investments. They've committed about $1 billion of capital for my colleagues in the investment team to invest. We also will then work with member companies and others in our network to implement solutions from those portfolio companies to try and drive impact at a global scale. That impact is measured in CO2 equivalents that our investments produce. Humans create roughly 50 gigatons a year of CO2 equivalent emissions. About 3/4 of that does get naturally sunk back into the environment, but that does leave somewhere north of 15 gigatons a year that we collectively need to address, and that is what we're working on at Climate Investments. And this graphic shows where they come from. Certainly, energy and industry are big parts of it, agriculture and other use, but also transport and buildings. And so the non-agricultural area is generally where we are focusing our efforts at Climate Investments, and we break it into 3 particular categories. The first is reducing methane emissions from oil and gas, primarily in the upstream and midstream sectors, reducing carbon dioxide emissions in energy and industry, and that does include energy efficiency. And then finally, what we refer to as recycling and storing carbon dioxide, that's carbon capture, usage, and sequestration. I'll take you through briefly some of the ways that we've done it and some of the types of investments we've made, beginning with reducing methane emissions. So we seek to invest in companies that can detect, measure, and mitigate methane. As far as detecting and measuring, we have 3 primary companies in our portfolio that do that. GHGSat, which has satellites detecting methane from orbit. SeekOps uses drones and handheld sensors to get to a very pinpointed detection of methane. And then Kairos Aerospace does aviation-mounted sensors. And then down at the measuring and mitigation, we have Q Energy Clark Valve, which have equipment for reducing methane and putting it to use in things like on-site power generation and efficient valves. And then Urbint, Ambient, and Kelvin are applying artificial intelligence to measuring and mitigating and helping businesses recognize parts of their process where they can improve the reduction of methane. For reducing CO2 emissions, we cover a number of different sectors. Norse Power is one that has rotary sails that is reducing the amount of emissions from ocean-going vessels. On-truck Acades and XL Fleet are addressing ground transportation through efficient engines, hybridization, as well as efficient utilization of shipping. 75F is doing efficient buildings. Solidia and Boston Metal are addressing low carbon cement and steel. And then Metron is providing a platform for industrial processes to recognize where they can improve efficiency that both will help with margins as well as reducing emissions. And finally, recycling carbon dioxide. And we break this into both utilization and storage. As far as utilization, we have a couple of investments in Elk Hills Carbon and one with Starwood and Elysian, and they are utilizing the carbon through enhanced oil recovery. In addition, Econic and Solidia are using the CO2 that is captured for creating polyols in the case of Econic. And in the case of Solidia, they use the CO2 as a curing agent. And then we also have investments that are taking the CO2 and putting it into geologic storage. Net Zero Teesside, which is one of our hub projects in the UK, is going to be storing the CO2 in the North Sea. Wabash Valley Resources and Next Decade are removing CO2 from a gasification hydrogen project and an LNG project respectively, and both of those will store the CO2 in underground features. I mentioned the Net Zero Teesside hub project. That is actually the first hub that the OGCI members have been working on. That is going to capture emissions from a new combined cycle power plant, as well as industrial emitters in that area, and store the CO2 in the Humber, not the Humber, in the North Sea, in the Endurance Field is what it's called. There are 3 other well-defined hubs in Northwest China, the Netherlands, and Norway. And in addition, there are 4 additional hubs that are currently under evaluation. 2 are in the Gulf Coast of the United States. 1 is in Canada, and the 3rd one is in Italy. The key for hubs is economies of scale. And the member companies recognize that one of the ways to help advance CO2 storage is to create a large network of transportation that can store a large amount in major underground features, so that we can share the costs over a number of emitters. And these hubs will typically be well north of 5 million tons of CO2 storage per year. In many cases, they'll exceed 8 to 10 tons per year. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the underlying economic value that investors should be looking for and can find in CO2 capture and storage. So one of the key things is that CO2 needs to have a value placed on it in order for investors to be willing to fund projects and solutions. For carbon capture and sequestration, there are a few different ways that one can achieve value. Certainly, many of us are familiar with enhanced oil recovery. CO2 has been used for oil production for quite some time, and we're now having opportunities to not just use it for oil production, but combine it with capture from emissions for a bit of a circular economy. There are also opportunities for emitters to essentially pay tipping fees to dispose of their emissions from their process. And in those cases, we would expect the end users of those products and services to avoid the cost of the CCS. Couple ways that might happen would either be through market-based means, where a particular product might have a premium placed on it for being a low carbon product. And also, depending on the region, there could be government subsidies, costs that are socialized through service rates, such as through feed-in tariffs or through the tax base, whether that be with a carbon tax or, in the case of the United States, a production tax credit that is funded by the taxpayers. One thing I'd like the audience to keep in mind is that while the cost of capturing and storing CO2 can be quite material, when you think about a finished product, such as a bridge or a toll road that is using raw materials that can be provided through a low carbon product, say low carbon cement or steel, because of all the elements besides just those building materials add up to the cost. While you might have, say, a 40% premium on the cost of a low carbon cement, the impact on the finished product might only be 5 or 6%, perhaps in some cases even lower. So when you get down to the costs that are actually socialized to end users and beneficiaries, the increased cost of producing low carbon products, it really is not prohibitive. I'll also briefly touch on methane emissions. Methane being such a very potent greenhouse gas, it's important to address that, which we also do in our investment activity at Climate Investments. And some of the things that we have observed through our investment activity are capturing fugitive gases in the oil field to be used in operations, say for steam generation. Also for on-site power generation. There's a lot of diesel-powered or diesel-fueled power generation used in the energy industry. And when you can capture on-site gas and use it in the same equipment, that reduces both the emissions from the generators as well as emissions from transporting diesel out to the sites. Now, of course, policy is a very big part of market adoption. There are different policy structures that vary by region, and a lot of it has to do with what is convention for different societies. In the United States, for instance, tax credits are something that have been very successful, and we've seen it really promote renewable energy, and we have a tax credit regime to advance carbon capture and sequestration. We refer to it as 45Q, and it is essentially a production-based tax credit where the emitter receives a credit up to $50 per metric ton for CO2 that is captured and stored or put to some industrial use. There are also other incentives. One called the low carbon fuel standard is an incentive that is used in California and is also potentially going to be expanded to other states. And that is one where fuel producers can receive a premium for a low carbon product. Now, in other regions, there are different methods, such as Canada. Canada is imposing a carbon tax. In Europe, there is a EU-wide emission trading system. Germany is adding a fixed price adder for carbon to transport and heating fuels to try and drive behavior. And then there's also voluntary programs such as carbon offset trading, which right now is essentially a bilateral market where companies that are looking to offset some of their carbon footprint can purchase offsets from the developers of projects, whether that be an industrial reduction of CO2 or in many cases agricultural means for producing or for reducing CO2, such as nature-based solutions. Key things to keep in mind as far as what is going to provide incentives to investors with policy is that market-based solutions, in order for investors to really deploy capital, They need to drive participation at scale. And some of the key things investors want to see is predictability and liquidity. In terms of predictability for projects, they would want to see long-term contracted cash flows. They'll also want to see high liquidity and low price volatility, particularly if the lifetime of their investment is going to exceed the lifetime of a contracted cash flow stream. And then the last would be a stable policy environment. Investors want to be very comfortable that the policy regime that is driving the revenue and cash flow stream that underlies the investment in the decarbonization project is going to be in place for the long term, and that it would not change and be reduced during the time of their investment. Having that confidence is very important to keeping the cost of capital low, so that these projects can find capital that is going to be akin to infrastructure investors. Thinking about what the returns might look like for a carbon capture and usage and storage investment, I like to think about it in terms of the concentration of the CO2 streams. Because the cost of capture is very energy intensive, the more concentrated the stream of CO2 is, that's going to be the easiest and least energy intensive way to capture the CO2. And those are the opportunities today where investors can make the highest returns. Some of those processes that have the highest concentration would be, say, ethanol, natural gas processing, and ammonia production. In terms of, if you look at the cost of capture, transport, and storage, capture at, say something in the tens of millions of dollars is relatively modest. Transport is oftentimes not going to be terribly expensive, and then the storage is going to depend on how much development is needed. But in these cases where your capture is significantly lower than in the dilute streams, we're seeing opportunities for investors to make unlevered returns in the double digits today. Now, if we look at the dilute streams, such as gas-fired power, which is an area where there's a lot of attention, or cement and metals production, these are streams of CO2 that are much less concentrated. In many cases, they're less than 10% of the overall emissions. So it is much more expensive to separate the CO2 out, in part because of the energy usage. So instead of something less than 100 million for the same size capture of CO2, it might be something in the 400 to 500 million, which is going to drive down your returns to something in the low single digits, which is really not very attractive to investors today. However, with modest reduction in capture costs through technology advancements or additional policy support, it is possible for us to get the dilute streams to a point where they could be more attractive to investors, which I think would need to be somewhere, in the modest double-digit returns on an unlevered basis. And the last thing I'd like to discuss in my prepared remarks is just how we look at the different capital pieces that go into the capitalization stack of a project in terms of the development cycle for projects. If we think about it in terms of the risk profile of an asset, the early stage development portions are the ones that will be the highest risk. So, pre-feed and feed, this is going to be the highest risk portion. And there will be certain investors that are looking to originate that type of risk. Certainly your developers, they're putting in their own time and their own capital, and that is something that they are purpose built for taking that higher risk. And then they will typically bring in co-investors around the time of construction. Now, there's also strategic investors who are looking to help advance projects in a more risky stage. Climate investments falls into that camp, we typically do invest in pre-feed and feed stages because part of our mission is to help de-risk these projects to the point where more traditional capital would come in. Strategic investors will also consider staying in for construction and operations, but it will vary depending on what their organization type is. Typical fund investors will usually be either early stage or later stage. It's not as common to find funds that will stay in for the entire period, but corporate investors will often come in earlier and then seek to stay in through the operation period. Now, once a project gets through feed and it's ready to go into construction, it's essentially a de-risked asset. It's become an infrastructure type asset, and lower cost of capital investors will be interested at that point. Some corporates and strategics will come in towards the end of feed and will actively be looking to stay in for construction. They will be a little bit higher price for their capital than what you might find for infrastructure. Infrastructure funds, they will typically come in no earlier than construction. Sometimes they don't want to come in until operations, but private equity investors that are willing to take on a bit of a higher risk profile, they very frequently will want to come in during construction because they can capture a return premium for some of the construction risk. Project lenders will come in when construction begins. Many of them will then convert the loans from a construction loan into a long-term term loan for a period of operations, and the tenor of that operating loan will typically match the contracted cash flows. So if you have an offtake agreement for 12 years, the lenders will typically want to stay in for about that period of time. Once in a while, they might stay in for a tail period slightly longer than the contracted period, but they like to match it up as much as possible. And then operating company investors, these would be what we refer to as sponsor capital. And that can be that can be strategics or infrastructure funds, but these will typically be investors that want to have a role in the operations of the project, and they will put in their own capital as well as earn fees from leading the operations. And then finally, in the case of the US, this is fairly specific because of the tax attributes that not every investor or every developer is able to monetize on their own. There are companies that have significant United States taxable income that will deploy that tax appetite through an investment in the tax attributes. We refer to that as tax equity. Tax equity investors tend to be fairly risk averse. They do not take on construction risk. So typically the tax equity will fund at the time that operations commence, when a project has been commissioned. So my overall point in this slide is just for investors to be thinking about where they would want to participate in a decarbonization project based on what their risk appetite is. There are a number of different places where you can have opportunities that will match both your risk appetite and your return requirements. And the best way to evaluate these opportunities is to talk with developers and co-investors to understand what their total project life cycle will look like, so that you can find the right opportunity to deploy your capital and to contribute to the decarbonization challenge that we're all working on. I very much appreciate your time. I've left my contact information up here. I always welcome direct contact about questions or opportunities or ways that we can collaborate. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Melwin for any Q&A.
James, thank you for your presentation. If any attendees have any questions, please do share it directly to Mr. James or send it to me and I will have it answered. In the meantime, James, we do have something that we can discuss for the next event. and I will coordinate with you soon.
Okay.
You have a nice day ahead. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.